My name is Alex, I'm 26 years old, and until last Saturday night, I believed Ick knew exactly who I was, the younger brother of Brian. Mitchell, graphic designer at a mid-sized marketing firm in Chicago, occasional amateur photographer, and perpetually single. Guy with a complicated crush I'd spent years trying to suppress. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have imagined, was that a single drunken confession at a bachelor party would unravel the fabric of my identity and rewrite the story of my life in ways I never saw coming. But I'm getting ahead of myself to understand what happened that night and everything that came after. You need to know how Brian and I got there in the first place. Brian was my older brother by 4 years growing up. He was everything I wasn't: athletic, effortlessly popular, the kind of person who commanded attention just by walking into a room where I was quiet and introspective. Brian was boisterous and charismatic, where I preferred the company of books and my camera. Brian thrived in crowds, center of every social circle. Despite these differences, we were close in the way that can only happen when you're raised by a single parent who works 2 jobs to keep the lights on. Mom did her best, but she couldn't be everywhere, so Brian stepped up. He walked me to school, helped with my homework, made sure I ate something besides cereal for dinner when Mom worked late shifts at the hospital. He was my brother, my protector, and sometimes the closest thing I had to a parent. As we grew older, paths diverged as expected. Brian went to college on a partial basketball shifts, while I stayed local, commuting to save money. While studying design, we saw each other less frequently, but remained close. Our bond, seemingly unshakable despite the physical distance. It was during those college years that things began to get complicated for me. Somewhere between Brian's sophomore and junior years, my admiration for him deepened into something that made me increasingly uncomfortable. I found myself thinking about him in ways that brothers shouldn't, anticipating his visits home with a nervous excitement that went beyond normal sibling affection. I buried these feelings, of course, locked them away in the darkest corner of my mind, and threw away the key. I dated other people, men who sometimes, if I was being honest with myself, resembled Brian in subtle ways, and convinced myself that what I felt was nothing more than confused admiration for the person who had been my role model throughout childhood. By the time we were both out of college and working, Brian as a financial analyst in the city, me at my design job, I thought I had everything under control. Saw each other regularly for Sunday dinners at Mom's place, occasional basketball games or drinks when our schedules aligned. I believed I'd successfully compartmentalized my inappropriate feelings, relegated them to a locked box that would never be opened. Then came Kevin's batch. Kevin had been Brian's roommate in college, part of the tight-knit group of friends that had adopted me as an honorary member during those years. When he announced his engagement and named Brian as his best man, no one was surprised. The surprise came when Kevin insisted that I had to attend the bachelor weekend as well, despite my protests that I wasn't really part of the core group. "Shut up, Tom," he'd said when I tried to decline. "You've been hanging around since you were a skinny 18-year-old. You're as much a part of this group as anyone." And so I found myself at a rented lake house 3 hours from the city, with neither guys, a ridiculous amount of alcohol, and a weekend of planned debauchery that made me mildly anxious, even as I appreciated being included. The first day passed in a blur of boat rides, swimming, grilling, and drinking games I was terrible at. I stayed relatively sober, volunteering as designated driver for the beer run, and taking photos that I knew Kevin and the others would appreciate. Once the weekend's haze had worn off, Brian uncharacteristically seemed to be keeping pace with me, rather than the others nursing the same beer for hours as we sat on the dock watching the sunset. "Not feeling it tonight?" I asked him, surprised by his restraint. Brian shrugged, his gaze fixed on the horizon where the sun was melting into the lake in streaks of orange and pink. "Just thinking." Dangerous activity at a bachelor party, I joked, trying to lighten whatever mood had settled over him. He smiled, but it didn't reach high size. "Yeah, well, someone's got to be the responsible one. For once, might as well me." Before I could question this uncharacteristic statement, we were called back to the house for the evening's official festivities, which promised to be significantly rowdier than the dice activities. I was right to be concerned. By midnight, the lake house had transformed into something resembling a college frat party, complete with ridiculous drinking challenges, increasingly vulgar toasts to the groom-to-be, and the kind of booze-fueled confessions that people either completely forget or deeply regret. The next morning, Found myself on the periphery as usual, sipping a single beer, and watching the chaos unfold with the detached amusement of the perpetual observer. What struck me as odd was that Brian, normally at the center of such gatherings, seemed similarly withdrawn. Who was drinking more heavily now than he had been earlier, but instead of becoming more sociable, he grew increasingly quiet, watching the proceedings with a strange intensity that seemed out of place around 1 o'clock in the morning when Kevin was performing a disturbing but hilarious striptease to pour some sugar on me while standing on the coffee table. Brian suddenly appeared at my side, swaying slightly, and smelling of the whiskey that had been circulating forth past hour. Need some air, he muttered, his words slightly slurred. Come with me. I nodded, relieved for an excuse to escape the increasingly rowdy scene. We slipped out onto the back deck unnoticed. The cool night air, a welcome airspit from the stuffy testosterone-filled living room. The lake stretched out before us, a vast expanse of darkness, broken only by the reflection of the moon, creating a silver pathway across the surface. Brian leaned heavily against the railing, his breathing uneven in a way that suggested he'd had significantly more Todd drink than I'd realized. I stood beside him, close enough to catch him if he stumbled, but giving him the space he seemed to need. You okay? I asked when several minutes had passed in silence. Brian laughed, a harsh sound without humor. No, not even a little bit. Thorough honesty in his voice startled me. Brian was rarely vulnerable, even with me. What's going on? Is it work or Ashley? Ashley was his most recent girlfriend. How? I hadn't heard him mention her in weeks. Ashley's gone, he said flatly, and dead at last. Month said. I was emotionally unavailable. He pronounced the words carefully, as if quoting directly. I'm sorry, I offered, though secretly, I'd never thought she was right for him. You didn't mention it, Brian shrugged, still staring out at the lake. Didn't see the point. It's not like it was to seem always emotionally unavailable, according to. He waved his hand. Vaguely I've ever dated. I didn't know how to respond to that. In my experience, Brian had always been deeply caring, attentive to the needs of others to a fault, but I also knew that what I saw Ashley's brother might be very different from what his romantic partners experienced. Kevin's getting married, Brian continued after a moment, his train of thought apparently and Sophia just had a baby. Jason and Diane bought that house in the suburbs. He took another drink, directly from the whiskey bottle he'd apparently brought outside with him. Everyone's moving forward, building lives, and I'm just stuck. You're not stuck, I protested. You've got a great career, friends, your own place. That's not what I mean, he interrupted. I'm stuck here. He tapped his temple with his free hand. Stuck in my head with things I can't say, things I can't change. The raw pain in his voice made my chest ache. I'd never seen Brian like this. Vulnerable, wounded, stripped off the confident persona he usually projected. You can tell me anything, I said softly. You know that, right? Brian turned to look at me, then really look at me, his eyes reflecting the moonlight in a way that made them appear almost luminous. Can I though? Because I'm pretty sure there are some things that would make you never want to speak to me again. That's not possible, I assured him, meaning it completely. There was nothing he could say that would make me turn away from him, not after everything we'd been through together. He studied my face for a long moment, swaying slightly where he stood, the whiskey clearly taking its toll. Then, with a decisiveness that seemed to surprise even him, he set the bottle down on the railing with a sharp click. You want to know why I'm emotionally unavailable? He asked, forming air quotes with his fingers. Why every relationship I've had has eventually fallen apart. Why I came out here tonight instead of doing body shots with the guys like I normally would. I nodded, unsure where this was going, but willing to follow. Because of you, Tom. The words hung in the night, air between us heavy with implication I couldn't yet decipher. Replacing concern. What did I do? Brian ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration I'd seen countless times throughout our lives. You didn't do anything. It's not about it. You did. It's about what I feel, what I've felt for years now. He took a deep, shuddering breath. I'm in love with you. The words didn't register at first, my brain refusing to process them in the context they were spoken. Brian was drunk, emotional, clearly not thinking clear. Lie must have meant something else, something brotherly and platonic that was getting lost in the whiskey haze. Brian, you're drunk, I said gently. Let's get you some water in. I'm drunk, but I'm not confused, I interrupted, his voice gaining strength. I know exactly what I'm saying. I'm in love with you, Tom, not as a brother, as he gestured helplessly, as everything else in. I know it's wrong and impossible, and probably makes me the worst person alive, but it's been eating me alive for years. He felt as if the deck had dropped out from under me, leaving me suspended in free fall. The words aligned too perfectly with feelings I'd buried so deeply I could almost pretend they didn't exist. This had to be some kind of cosmic joke, a hallucination, anything but reality. "We're brothers," I reminded him, my voice sounding distant to my own ears. We can't, that's just it," Brian said, his expression shifting to something I couldn't read in the dim light. "We're not really." The world tilted further on its axis. "What are you talking about?" Brian sank down onto one of the deck chairs, suddenly looking exhausted. "I wasn't going to tell you, I promised Mom I never would, but I can't keep carrying all these secrets." He looked up at me, his eyes clearer than they should. "Have been given how much had to drink. You're not my biological brother. Tom, you're not even related to me." I stood frozen, unable to move or respond, as Brian continued, the words pouring out of him now, as if a dam had broken. "Mum was best friends with your biological mother in nursing school when she died in that car accident. You were only 2, your dad was already gone. Deployed overseas, then killed in action before he even knew his wife had died. There was no other family to take you. Mom had just divorced my dad and she was already raising me alone, but she couldn't bear the thought of you going into the system, so she adopted youth." Story was so detailed, so specific, it couldn't be a drunken fabrication, yet it contradicted everything I believed about my life, my identity, my place in the world. "That's not possible," I managed. "Definitely. I would know. There would be papers or memories or something. The adoption was finalized when you were 3. Brian continued. "Mom didn't think you needed the confusion of understanding it all when you were so young. She planned to tell you when you were older, but then time passed and you were so secure in your identity as her son, as my brother. She worried that telling you would only hurt you. And you've known all this time." The betrayal in my voice was unmistakable. Brian nodded, misery etched into every line of his face. "Since I was 12, I overheard her talking to Aunt Jen about it. I confronted her, and she made me promise never to tell you. Said it was her story too. Share when time was right." "And when exactly was the right time, Brian?" I demanded, anger rising to a place. "Shock, after 24 years of living a lie, or were you planning to wait until Mimi's funeral to mention? Oh, by the way, we're not actually related. I'm telling you now because I can't live with these secrets anymore," Brian said, his voice breaking. "Because I've spent years hating myself for having feelings for my brother, only to find out you're not my brother." But I still couldn't say anything, because you believed you were it. "Oh, you have any idea what that's like, to be in love with someone you've been told all your life is forbidden, then to learn they're not actually forbidden, but you still can't have them because they don't know the truth?" Raw pain in his voice cut through my anger, leaving me disoriented and conflicted. I sank into the chair opposite him, trying to process everything. I just learned if what Brian was saying was true, and some deep instinct told me it was, then my entire identity was built on a foundation of half-truths. I wasn't Brian's brother, he wasn't Margaret Mitchell's biological son. I was who exactly? My mother, I said finally. My biological mother. What was her name? Brian's expression softened with relief, perhaps, at my implicit acceptance of his story. Elizabeth Rionch went by Lizzie. She and Mum were roommates in nursing school. There are photos of her in Mum's old albums. Sheggy's always told you she was a friend. The name meant nothing to me, created no spark of recognition or sense of connection, yet it was supposedly the name of the woman who had given birth to me, whose genes I carried, whose death had set in motion the chain of events that led to my adoption. "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked, though I already knew the answer after all these years of keeping the secret. Brian met my gazebo vulnerability and determination wearing in his expression. "Because I'm tired of living with secrets, because Kevin's getting married, and I'm watching all my friends build honest lives while I'm suffocating under things I can't say." "Because," he hesitated, then continued, more quietly, "because I've seen the way you look at me sometimes, when you think I won't notice, and I've wondered if maybe, just maybe, you feel something too." Threads hung in the air between us, a question and a confession rolled into one. I could have denied it, could have dismissed his observation as drunken, wishful thinking, but after the seismic revelations of the past few minutes, another lie seemed pointless. "I've spent years hating myself." I admitted the words, feeling like they were being torn from somewhere deep inside me, "for having feelings no brothers hold. Have I tried to bury them, to date other people, to convince myself it was just some weird hero worship left over from childhood, but it never went away." Brian's intake of breath was audible in the quiet night. "So you do feel something?" I nodded, unable to form words that would make it real. We sat in silence. For what felt like eternity, the implications of our mutual confession specting between us, like ripples on the lake's surface. What happens now? I asked finally. Brian ran his hands over his face, suddenly looking exhausted. I don't know. I didn't plan this. I didn't mean to tell you any of it tonight, Botu. Did I point it out, and we can't unknow it before? Brian could respond. The sliding door to the deck opened, spilling light and noise out. Into the night. Kevin stood there, clearly intoxicated, but with focused determination of a man on a mission. There you are, he exclaimed. You're missing the party. Dudes were about to start he hiccuped. The thing with the you-know-what. Just come inside. Bachelor's orders. Brian and I exchanged a glance loaded with unspoken understanding. This conversation would have to wait. With a sigh, Brian stood, plastering on a smile that didn't reach his eyes, coming right in if just getting some fresh air. The remainder of the night passed in a haze of noise and forced celebration. I remained on the periphery, nursing the same beer and watching as Brian threw himself into the festivities with a desperate energy that seemed designed to burn away the vulnerability he'd shown on the deck. He drank more, laughed louder, participated in increasingly ridiculous dares with a recklessness that worried me. By the time the party finally wound down, around 4 o'clock a.m., most of the guys were passed out in various locations around the house. Brian had disappeared out 20 minutes earlier, and I found him in the bedroom we were supposed to be sharing with 2 other friends who were currently unconscious on the living room floor, sitting on the edge of his bed with his head in his hands. I closed the door quietly behind me, not wanting to wake the rest of the house. Hey, I said softly, you okay? Brian looked up, high size, bloodshot from alcohol and exhaustion. Define okay, he replied with a humorless laugh. I sat on my own bed, facing him across the narrow space between us. Fair point. We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of everything said and unsaid pressing down on us. Finally Brian spoke, his voice rough with emotion. I'm sorry, Tom, for dropping all of that on you tonight. It wasn't fair. Noy agreed. It wasn't, but I'm still trying to figure out what part I'm most upset about. That you told me I'm adopted, or that you've known for years and said nothing. Brian winced. Both are pretty bad, I acknowledged, though I understand why you kept it. It wasn't your secret to tell. That's what I kept telling myself, Brian said, but it felt like a lie of omission every day, especially after he'd railed off. Not finishing the thought after you realized how you felt about me, I supplied, forcing myself to face the revelation of the night head on. Brian nodded, not meeting my eyes, and after I started to suspect you might feel something. To the acknowledgement hung between us, charged with possibility and danger in equal measure. We were venturing into uncharted territory, without the maps of social norms or shared experiences to guide us. Everything I thought I knew about myself, about Brian, about our relationship, had been appended in the span of a few hours. I need time, I said finally, to process all of this, to figure out what it means for me, for us, of course. Brian agreed quickly. Take all the time you need. I never meant to rush you into anything. I never even meant to tell you tonight, Botu, did I? Repeated my earlier words. And now we have to figure out where we go from here. The conversation stalled there, both of us too exhausted emotionally and physically to continue. We went through the motions of preparing for sleep, moving around each other with the careful choreography of people suddenly unsure of the boundaries between them. I lay in the dark, listening to Brian's breathing gradually even out. As he drifted into sleep, I tried to make sense of the kaleidoscope of emotions churning within me: anger at the lifetime of deception, however well-intentioned, confusion about my true identity, and what it meant for my sense of self-relief that the feelings I'd condemned myself for weren't actually as taboo as I'd believed. Fear about what would happen when we returned to real life and had to face the implications of everything we'd learned and confessed it. Underneath it all, a dangerous, trembling hope that perhaps against a lot, there was a path forward where Brian and I could explore the connection between us without the shadow of shared blood hanging over us. I must have fallen asleep eventually, because the next thing I knew, sunlight was streaming through the blinds and the sounds of hungover men stumbling around the kitchen filtered through the closed door. Brian's bed was empty, the cover shelf officiously pulled up, as if he'd left in a hurry. The events of the previous night crashed back over me with the force of a tidal wave. For a brief, disorienting moment, I wondered if it had been a dream. The confession on the deck, the revelation about my acknowledgement of mutual feelings, but the absence of Brian from the room, and the hollow ache in my chest confirmed that it had all been terrifyingly real. I took my time getting up, dreading the inevitable awkwardness of facing Brian in the harsh light of day, surrounded by our hungover friends, who had no idea of the seismic shift that had occurred between us. When I finally emerged from the bedroom scene in the kitchen was exactly what I expected. A group of grown men looking worse for wear, consuming greasy breakfast foods and comparing stories from the night before. Brian was at the stove, apparently, having appointed himself chef for the morning. He glanced up when I entered, his expression carefully neutral, save for the slight darkening of his cheeks. "Morning," he said, his voice overly casual, fresh. I nodded my thanks, pouring myself a cup and finding a place at the crowded table where I could observe without being directly in Brian's line of sight. The conversation swirled around me to outrageous dares, accusations of who had been the most embarrassingly drunk, plans for the day's recovery activity. Participated minimally, my mind elsewhere. The day passed in a blur of forced normality. As the designated least hungover person, I was tasked with making the beer and supply run, giving me a blessed hour of solitude to try to sort through my thoughts. By the time I returned, the group had rallied somewhat and were planning an afternoon boat excursion. "You coming, Tom?" Kevin asked, as they prepared to head down to the dock, "or are you still playing team sober?" "I think I'll pass," I replied, forcing a smile. "Someone should stay back and clean up a bit." Kevin shrugged, too focused on his own recovery to question my excuse. "Suit yourself." Brian, staying too, said something about a work call he can't miss. My heart rate accelerated. At this information, Brian hadn't mentioned anything about staying behind, and given how actively he'd been avoiding being alone with me all day, I suspected the work call was as much an excuse as my sudden interest in housekeeping. As the rest of the group made their noisy way down to the lake, the house fell into an almost unnatural quiet. I busied myself collecting empty bottles and cups from around the living room, using the mundane task to delay the inevitable conversation. Brian appeared in the doorway from the kitchen, watching me work for a moment before speaking. "You don't have to do that. You know they medethymis. They can clean it up." I shrugged, not looking at him. "Gives me something to do." He nodded, understanding. Subtext: "We should talk, Tom, should we?" I continued collecting bottles, still avoiding his gaze. "Or should we just pretend last night never happened? That seems to be what you've been doing all day." The accusation hung in the air between us, justified, but perhaps unfair given the circumstances. Brian sighed, running a hand through his hair, in that familiar gesture of frustration. "I've been giving you space," he corrected, "like you asked for, and trying not to make things even more awkward for you in front of the guys." He was right, and we both knew it. "Is it down the trash bag?" I'd been filling and finally turned to face him. "I'm sorry, that wasn't fair." Brian shrugged, moving further into the room but maintaining a careful distance. "None of this is fair to either of us." The simplicity of the statement cut through my defensive anger, leaving only the raw confusion and hurt beneath. "I don't know how I am anymore, Brian," I admitted, the words surprisingly difficult to voice. "Everything I thought I knew about myself, about my place in the world, about us, it's all been turned upside down in a single night." Brian's expression softened with genuine remorse. "I know, and I'm so sorry for that. If I could take it back, then." I interrupted. "Don't say you'd take it back, because as much as I'm struggling with all of this, there's a part of me that's relieved." "Relieved?" Brian echoed, confusion vedant in his furrowed brow. I nodded, finally putting words to the emotion that had been growing beneath the anger and confusion. "Relieved that I'm not actually in love with my brother, that the feelings I've been hating myself for aren't as wrong as I thought they were." Brian's intake of breath was audible in the quiet room. "You said it," he murmured, wonder replacing confusion. "Said what?" "That you're in love with me," he clarified, taking a hesitant step closer. "You've acknowledged the feelings, but you've never used that word before." I hadn't realized I'd said it, hadn't consciously chosen those specific words, but now that they were out hanging in the air between us, I knew they were true. "I guess I did," I acknowledged softly. "Did you mean it?" Brian asked, vulnerability naked in his expression. He could have backtracked, could have claimed it was just a figure of speech, or a slip of the tongue, but after years of hiding, of self-formation, of carefully constructed barriers, the truth felt like earth. "Only option, yes," I said simply. "I meant it. I've been in love with you, 4 years, hating myself for it. Every day trying to bury it under relationships that never worked because they weren't with you." The confession seemed to unlock something in Brian. The careful distance he had been maintaining disappeared as he crossed the room in 3 quick strides, stopping just short of touching me. "I meant it too," he said, his voice thick with emotion every word. I said last night, I love you, Tom, not as the brother I was raised to believe you were, but as the person you are. We stood facing each other, suspended in a moment of perfect understanding and terrifying possibility. Everything had changed between us, yet some fundamental truth remained constant. Whatever our biological relationship, we had shaped each other's lives in profound and irreversible ways. I still need time, I said, even as I swayed imperceptibly to him, to talk to Mum, to understand the full story, to figure out who I am if I'm not your brother, of course. Brian agreed immediately. We have all the time in the world. I'm not going anywhere. The promise in those words, of patience, of presence, of permanence, finally broke through the last of my reservations. I closed the remaining distance between us, and did what I'd imagined countless times but never believed would be possible. I kissed him. Contact was brief, tentative, a question rather, then a demand. Brian remained perfectly still for a heartbeat and responded with a gentleness that belied the years of suppressed longing behind it. His hands came up to frame my face, thumbs brushing my cheekbones as if memorizing their contours. When we separated, both slightly breathless, Brian rested his forehead against mine. We'll figure this out, he promised. Whatever comes next, we'll face in together. And for the first time since the revelations of the previous night, I believed that might be true. The drive back to the city the following day was subdued, all of us nursing various levels of hangover and post-fatigue. Brian and I sat in the back of Kevin's SUV, close but not touching our shared secret, creating an invisible bubble around us amid the general conversation. The first thing I did upon returning to my apartment was call my mother, or rather the woman I had always known as my mother, and asked to see her immediately. The conversation that followed was long, emotional, and ultimately healing. She confirmed everything Brian had told me, filling in details he hadn't known or hadn't. Sherrod showed me photos of Elizabeth Ryan, my biological mother, and told me stories about their friendship. She apologized deeply and sincerely for keeping the truth from me for so long. I was going to tell you, she insisted, tears streaming down her face. So many times I came close, but you were happy, secure in who you were. I was afraid of disrupting that, off making you feel like you didn't belong. I understand why you did it, I told her, and I meant it. The initial anger had faded, replaced by a complex mixture of emotions I was still sorting through. But I wish I'd known sooner. And Brian, she asked hesitantly, he told you? I nodded, careful not to reveal the full context of his confession at the bachelor party. It was time. Mum sighed, seeming to age before my eyes. I made him promise when he was 12. That was unfair of me, too much responsibility for a child. I should have known it would eventually become too heavy a burden for him to carry. The conversation continued long into the evening, painful at times, but necessary. By the time I left her house, I felt both lighter and more grounded. My understanding of my past fundamentally altered, but my sense of being loved by her, by Brian, stronger than ever. In the weeks that followed, Brian and I moved forward cautiously, weren't on proper dates, learning to interact, not as the brothers we'd believed ourselves to be, but as two people exploring a romantic connection, built on years of deep friendship and newly acknowledged attraction. We kept our relationship private initially, not out of shame, but out of recognition that others would need to adjust to the shift in our dynamic, especially those who had known us as brothers for years. The first person wettled after careful consideration was Kevin, whose bachelor party had been the catalyst for our transformation. His initial shock gave way to genuine happiness for us when we explained the full situation. So let me get this straight, he said, processing the revelation over beers at his apartment. You're not actually brothers, you've both been secretly in love with each other for years, and my drunken bachelor party was what finally brought it all out in the open. He shook his head in amazement. That's either the most romantic or the most bizarre thing I've ever heard. Both, Brian and I said in unison, then shared a smile that made Kevin roll his eyes good-naturedly. Well, whatever it is, I'm happy for you guys, he said. Sincerely though, I'm definitely putting this in my wedding speech. Now you absolutely are not, Brian warned, but the threat was undermined by his happiness evident in his expression. Telling others proved less traumatic than we'd feared. Most people in our lives had no idea I was adopted, so there was no need to explain. The shift from brothers to partners recently began appearing together socially in a way that made our relationship clear. The few who did know us as brothers, primarily family, friends and relatives, received the edited version. Iowa's adopted we'd recently discovered. We weren't biologically related, and our relationship had evolved as a result. There were awkward moments, certainly raised eyebrows, uncomfortable questions, occasional judgment from those who couldn't see past the family relationship we'd once shared. But for every difficult conversion, there were many more moments of acceptance and support of people who could see the genuine connection between us and celebrated it, regardless of its unusual origins. 6 months after that fateful night on the lake house deck, Brian and I moved in together, a step that might have seemed rushed in a new relationship, but felt natural given our lifelong connection. The apartment we chose was new to both of us, a fresh start in a space that carried no associations with our previous identities as brothers. On our first night there, surrounded by half-unpacked boxes and takeout containers, Brian pulled me into his arms and kissed me with a tenderness that still surprised me. "Sometimes happy?" he asked, searching my face as if confirming that this reality was as good as he'd imagined it might be. I considered the question seriously. The past 6 months had been a journey of rediscovery of myself, of Brian, of the truth of our shared history, and the possibilities of our future. There had been difficult moments, painful conversations, adjustments to a new way of relating to each other, and tough world. But through it all, there had been an underlying certainty that this was right, that we were exactly where we were meant to be. "Yes," I answered honestly, happier than I ever thought possible. And as Brian's smile brightened in response, I realized that was the most fundamental truth of all. Whatever complications had brought us to this point, whatever challenges might lead, the connection between us was real and enduring. We had found our way to each other through a lifetime of complex emotions and hidden truths, and now finally we were home. My name is Tom. I'm 27 years old now, and a year ago, a drunken confession at a bachelor party changed the course of my life forever. I learned that the person I'd always believed was my brother wasn't related to me by blood at all. I discovered that the feelings I'd condemned myself for weren't as forbidden as I'd thought. And most importantly, I found that sometimes the most profound truths emerge from moments of vulnerability, when the careful structures we've built around ourselves fall away and leave only the raw, honest core of who we are and what we truly want. Brian and I are still writing our story, navigating a relationship that doesn't fit neatly into any conventional category. But perhaps that's as it should be. After all, the most meaningful connections are often those that deface definition, that force us to create new maps for uncharted territory. And as unconventional as our journey has been, I wouldn't trade it for anything, because it led me precisely where I was always meant to.